Hello, and welcome to the podcast that tries to answer one simple question. What is this thing called film noir? I'm your host, Sergio Angelini, and welcome to Tipping My Fedora, where we discuss movies, books, TV, radio, and much more besides, all from the darker side of the street. Today's podcast is devoted to Dead Again, the 1991 film directed by Kenneth Branagh, who also co-stars with his then-wife Emma Thompson, and which was written by Scott Frank, and features a fantastic score by Patrick Doyle and terrific cinematography by Matthew F. Leonetti. My guest today is Nick Cardillo, who is a writer and actor. A lifelong fan of mystery and detective fiction, Nick is the author of several Sherlock Holmes pastiches for MX Publishing and Belanger Books. These were collected in The Feats of Sherlock Holmes in 2018 and The Improbable Case Book of Sherlock Holmes in 2021. He is the author of The Devil's Book, published in the Novellas of Solar Ponds, the first collection of longer stories based on August Derleth's pulp detective to be authorized by the Derleth estate. When he's not writing, Nick is an actor in the Philadelphia region and has been involved in productions of such diverse playwrights as William Shakespeare, Terrence McNally, Paula Vogel, and of course, Agatha Christie. Nick is currently at work on his first novel. Find out more on his website, nickcardillocreative.com. And now let's sit down and listen to what was a very wide-ranging and massively entertaining conversation. Nick, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you.
I'm so excited to be here today. Thank you.
Oh, this is brilliant. Before we get stuck in, I always ask everyone on the podcast two questions. The first is, what's your definition of film noir?
I've been thinking about this a lot, and I've come to the determination that film noir is a state of mind instead of a genre. There are elements to any movie, any story that can make it film noir. There's got to be some double crossing. There's got to be some paranoia, uncertainty, moral ambiguity. And if there's a trench coat and a fedora, it makes it even better. But I feel like I have really broadened what I classify as film noir as I've been thinking about answering this question.
With that in mind, what's big film noir title for you? What's maybe the first noir film that you saw that you thought, oh, I get what film noir is?
That's a little bit more difficult to answer because my relationship with film noir definitely extends back longer than I sort of knew what it was. I should say when I was about 6 or 7 years old, I was shown the Bela Lugosi Dracula at the local library around Halloween, and that really set off just my love of classic films in general and other horror movies of the 30s and 40s, and sort of that very naturally blended itself into film noir. I believe one of the first films that I saw in the genre was probably Laura, Otto Preminger's Laura, because it had Vincent Price. Beyond that, I saw I Wake Up Screaming. It's a great film, and I definitely associate I Wake Up Screaming with film noir in general. I haven't seen it in a long time, but I believe, it's got the flashbacks, it's got obsession, madness, a murder mystery. Everything around that movie feels like film noir to me. In high school, I took a creative writing class, and we did a mini unit on film noir, the dialogue, the style of film noir, and we had to write our own scripts for a film noir scene. And we watched Out of the Past in class, and that made a huge impact on me. This is what film noir is. This is what it looks like. This is what it sounds like. Again, it's a movie I have not revisited in a while, but it lives in my head as the golden example of what film noir properly is.
I agree completely. I mean, that's the one of two or three instant kind of go-to titles for me as well, with things like Double Indemnity maybe, but Out of the Past, it's sort of
absolutely
the classic title. It's some of the best dialogue. It's very doom-laden, great cast. the ultimate,
Mm-hmm.
one of the ultimate femme fatales of the genre, if we think of it as a genre, but as you say, as a state of mind, it absolutely captures it. Now, today we're going to be talking about a film that we both really like. It's one that you would refer to as neo-noir simply because it's a more recent film. It's Kenneth Branagh's 1991 release, Dead Again. I would consider it a bit neo-noir, but also a bit retro-noir, which is perhaps unnecessarily specific, because in the end, it's, I think, just feels like a great noir movie. So this is a film that is very knowing about its antecedents. So that's part of the enjoyment, is that there's clearly a love of Golden Age Hollywood within its making, and yet it's very much a film of its time, late 80s, early 90s. And there's a very distinctive way it has of presenting its then present and its film noirish past, because the present is in colour and the past is in black and white. I saw the film when it was first released at the cinema, which was, I believe, before you were born, Nick.
It was a little bit before my time, yes.
So that tells you everything about me and not very much about you. I loved it right away. I'm a big Kenneth Branagh fan. I'd seen Henry V. I'd seen Branagh and Emma Thompson on the stage. And I happened to be, I believe, in San Francisco at the time the film came out and saw it there. And it was a terrific experience. I had a fantastic time. And my enthusiasm for it remains undimmed. When did you first see it?
I was trying to think exactly. Before I had seen it, I had been a fan of Branagh. My introduction to Kenneth Branagh was probably Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is a movie I will go to bat for as Baroque over-the-top super entertainment. I know there's a lot of detractors for that film, but I enjoy it quite a bit. And after that, I sort of just wanted to see everything else that he did. The Shakespeare adaptations, of course, Hamlet, Henry V. And I ended up doing a project on Branagh my first year at college, and trying to fill in the gaps of the filmography, I ended up watching Dead Again. I had never heard of it before doing this project, and I found it in his IMDb. I watched the trailer, and part of what sold me on the movie was those black and white elements and those color elements. I thought, this looks like it was a movie that was made exactly for me. I watched it and I loved it. And it's been a movie that I have come back to a number of times in the years since. Even if I haven't watched it from start to finish, it's been one that I've thrown on and watched probably the first half hour, 45 minutes of quite a number of times, just because I enjoy the little world that Branagh builds in this movie, and I enjoy the noir vibes that it gives. It's a very unusual movie, and I'm sure that we'll dig into that a little bit more, but it has become one of those comfort films to revisit.
It has a lot of the conventions of film noir, and yet it does lots of unusual things with them. I mean, if you just did a quick list, you say, well, it's a private eye movie. It's got character with amnesia. It's shot in expressionistic black and white style. It uses flashbacks. It has first-person narration. It has the links to Europe and the old world, but also, of course, in the style of filmmaking. It's got dreams and nightmares and, of course, psychiatry. So all those things and more, but all those elements that you so often associate with many of the great melodramas from the 1940s and early 50s that you would now fold into film noir as we understand it. So it has all these wonderful elements. And yet, as you say, it's a film that takes actually a lot of chances. It's really trying to, in a way, have its cake and eat it, because it's both part of the cycle and sort of a reflection on it, and also, I think, maybe trying to undercut some of those conventions by sort of saying, hey, I'm going to actually take you in unexpected places because you're going to make certain assumptions based on films we've seen before. But hey, presto, I'm going to go over here with the story now. So it really isn't what you think it's going to be. And there are a couple of terrific twists that I think are kind of unique to film noir, frankly, that I can't decide if we're going to spoil them or not. I mean, it's a film that's been around a long time, but we'll have to see just how cagey we can be in describing certain elements of the story.
Sure.
So let's start with the story. So we begin in black and white, don't we? We begin in a prison cell.
Yes.
And Kenneth Branagh is playing a man on death row. He's been accused and found guilty of killing his wife, of stabbing her to death. And it's the day of his execution, and he's visited by this, you assume, maybe slightly scuzzy, slightly sleazy journalist played by Andy Garcia, who's terrific in it.
Absolutely.
And they have this great little dialogue, and he sort of says, I want you to say that, you know, our love will last forever and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, he's going to his death. And then he goes off. He's just had his hair cut, so that presumably that means it's going to be the electric chair. And he's heading off in that direction. And the Andy Garcia character realizes that the scissors with which his hair was cut have gone missing, and he tries to catch him and chases him, and he can't quite do it, suggesting that security wasn't as good in 1950 as it probably is today. And he goes out to the area where he's more or less walking the long mile, and all of a sudden, the woman who he's meant to have killed, who's his wife, played by Emma Thompson, is actually there. At which point, he pulls up the scissors, says, "These are for you," and stabs her. And then we cut. I love this sequence because right away it's a fake out. You assume you're actually in the past and you're seeing what really happened. And it sets your mind to accept that reality, that the background of the film, the one in the 40s and 50s, is going to be in black and white. Okay, the setting. But then it also establishes that he either is or isn't guilty, but we actually see him basically stab her. So in our minds, we think, okay, well, he basically did it. And then we find out it's a nightmare. And the Emma Thompson other character that she plays in the film, because Branagh and Thompson play two characters. This was apparently not always the intention of the original script, but I think a lot of people always assumed that because there's a connection between the characters in the past and the present, that they would perhaps be played by the same actors as they are in this film. And she was just having a bad dream or a bad memory or something else. But of course, it's not real. As we discover, that scene can't have happened as depicted because, apart from anything else, she's dead. So he can't have stabbed her in that way.
And yet we do learn that what happened in the jail cell actually happened. And we learn that Branagh's 1940s character, Roman Strauss, his guard, wrote a tell-all book about what happened in those final days before Strauss was executed. It's a very striking way to start a film, and it puts you right into this mindset where, as you say, dreams and reality are going to meld together, along with the past and the present, which is a huge theme, obviously, of this film. Very timely, I have started a watch of Twin Peaks for the first time. This is another show where, dreams and reality are being fused together, and you're never quite sure what is real, what is not. This movie right up front is telling you that you can't always believe what's true and what's not. And it helps that it's filmed in striking black and white, and that scene of Branagh walking the last mile to the electric chair is beautifully shot in an expressionistic way, with the guards and the inmates rattling the bars in their cells, screaming out to him. It's really creepy, really nightmarish, and it sets a wonderful tone for the whole film.
One of the unusual things one learns in terms of production is that the entire film was actually shot in color, and that the decision to use black and white for the scenes in the past was made later. And it seems that it had, at least in part, to do with potential confusion for the audience. It was helpful to differentiate shall we say, the past and the present with a very specific visual coding so that you could distinguish one from the other. I suppose partly because although they're made up differently, they wear different clothes, and in the past the character that Branagh is playing has a goatee and different haircut, and he's playing an older man. But nonetheless, because it is both actors, and there are moments in the film where it's going to cross-cut quite quickly between the past and the present, I suspect that there was that way of helping the audience along. I mean, one always hates the idea that you have to treat audiences like they're idiots, but this seems to have been an output of the preview process. We cut to the present, and Emma Thompson is playing this woman who has some form of amnesia. She doesn't seem to know who she is. She's also become mute, so she's had some kind of trauma. So in fact, they don't even know if she can speak at the beginning of the film because nobody knows who she is. And she's ended up going to this place that's run by the church. It's a school for orphan boys, I think is what it's called, I think. We quite quickly realise that this is the same building in which the characters in the past used to actually live. It's also the first of what are going to be several references to Orson Welles' Citizen Kane and also Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca. In this case, it's that shot from the beginning of Kane where you reach the gates and instead of a big K, it's got a musical stave on it because, of course, he's playing... Roman Strauss is a composer, a serious composer. He's working on his magnum opus, which is an opera. So she's ended up in this particular building. They don't want her just lying around there because they don't know what to do with her. So she's going to have to be taken to the hospital. One of the boys who used to stay there has grown up and went to join the police briefly, worked in missing persons, and has now set himself up as, I suppose, a private detective, but not in the obvious way. One of the nice things about the film is this is not in any way, shape or form the obvious private eye figure. I mean, yes, he's got a nice old car, wants to quit smoking, so it's almost like he wants to be a hard-boiled guy but can't quite manage it. Seems to have a lot of trouble with commitment. There's kind of various references to him not exactly getting very far with his girlfriends. As he says in the film, I'm not looking for Miss Right, I'm looking for Miss Right now. And nonetheless, throughout the film, we see he doesn't sort of strike he's not Robert Mitchum, let's put it that way. He's a much more accessible guy, fundamentally. But what he mainly specialises in is finding people who have come into inheritances and things like that. They call him in as a favour, and there is this... It's played for laughs, but there's this kind of slightly horrible sequence where they take her to the sort of county hospital or whatever, and it's this gothic nightmare of complete pandemonium and people screaming at each other. There are fights breaking out. He can't possibly leave her there, so he's saddled with her. He's going to have to take her home to his place for the moment while he gets a newspaper friend played by Wayne Knight, more or less in his first film, or I think it's maybe his second screen role. Is going to put a photo of her in the paper and simply say, does anybody know who she is? I think that is an interesting tonal shift that I like in the film. We start with this scary black and white nightmare and this difficult situation for this poor woman who can't remember, has some form of retrograde amnesia, as literally can't speak. And then we get this slightly dark but humorous introduction to his character. And we also get that great scene with Robin Williams, who also gives a weird bit of humour. Yes. I love his role in it. Plays the psychiatrist, except he's a disbarred, defrocked psychiatrist who...
He is, for having slept with his patients.
Yeah, although it's in a way, it's presented in quite a nice way. It's not like I didn't care about them. Well, ho-hum.
Sure.
But...
I wanted to speak to a number of the points that you've brought up, particularly about Branagh as a private investigator. And it's one of the things that I appreciate a lot about this movie is the almost gentle tone that Branagh, as both a star and a director, brings to this film, and why I feel like it's not your typical film noir setup. I think we tend to think of film noir as rough around the edges and very, hard-boiled specifically. And Branagh's private investigator character is not that. He's very humane. He has a very good sense of humor. He's very self-deprecating, very down to earth generally. Branagh's characterization is pretty lovable and pretty affable.
He is fundamentally kind-hearted, and you get, he's not
Yes.
going to go around beating people up. And in fact, there's a later sequence where there's the one, there's virtually very little action in the film. It's not that kind of movie. And there's one chase scene where he has to chase a guy down, and the character's played by Catball Scott, who's terrific in just a small role. And the other guy just completely cleans his clock.
He does, yeah. Roundhouse. One of my notes is roundhouse kick to the face, which comes out of nowhere, and really Branagh goes down.
He does say that line, doesn't he? Did that guy look to you like he knew karate?
But I think it's one of those fun ways that this movie is able to subvert a lot of the expectations or tropes of typical film noir. The other is Emma Thompson's character, though she is suffering from amnesia and at the beginning of the movie doesn't seem to be able to speak. Again, there's a gentleness, there's a tenderness to her performance and to the eventual characterization once she is able to find her voice. She's not the femme fatale of the movie, or at least certainly not in the typical sense. And the relationship that she and Branagh build over the course of the film certainly, goes into darker territory towards the end, but it does not feel like the typical backstabbing, ulterior motive kind of romance that you find in film noir like this.
One of the things that I think Branagh really brings to it, both as an actor but also as a director, is that he makes it a very romantic story. Scott Frank is a very smart writer. He's written lots of crime films. He's directed now several himself, and he's very savvy. He knows exactly what he's doing. And this was a very early script for him. If you look at the scripting carefully, you can see just how specific they're being to get their effects, to try and play completely straight with the audience and still have real surprises. You realize just how carefully the whole thing has been planned out right from the beginning. Literally from that opening sequence we talked about in Death Row. One of the aspects that, in fact, I think makes you want to go back and watch it again is how strong the developing relationship is between actually both the Emma Thompson and Kenneth Branagh characterizations. You want to see what happens to both of the two relationships that we see, because in the past sequence they play a composer, conductor and a concert pianist who get married, and then there are problems in the marriage and we need to find out why that is, and which seemingly seems to have been the rationale for why he killed her. I think it's very important in its celebration of a kind of golden age of Hollywood type movie making that we have a real romantic core to focus on. I don't think it's a spoiler to say that this is a film that comes to a proper conclusion and doesn't feel like a massive downer. It's not that kind of thing. It doesn't have a big trick ending that makes you feel like you've been smacked around the face.
It is a movie with a happy ending. The music swells. Branagh and Thompson embrace and kiss, and it fades to black.
And it's sweet. And we like that for it. Of course, we now reach our point in the film where we introduce an important third character, which is the one played by Derek Jacobi, apparently a role that originally had been offered to Donald Sutherland, and he couldn't do it, or chose not to. And so apparently Derek Jacobi was asked on Thursday, and he turned up in London. He turned up on Monday and started shooting. And he plays this antiques dealer who you assume he's a little bit of a chancer. He's forever sort of saying, "Oh, that's very nice. I'll give you $45." Just no, it's worth $150. Shut up. So he's behaving like you imagine people like that kind of tend to. But he's very important because he sees the item in the newspaper about Thompson, goes to see her and Branagh, because of course she's staying with him, and something very unexpected happens. So it's not a spoiler. This is very important in the film. He hypnotizes her. He must be, the world's greatest hypnotist. He gets her under incredibly fast. Right away, you realize there's something going on there, because she sort of shouts out in the dream. So she sort of has a sort of vision that when he hypnotizes her. And although she can't immediately get her voice back, it's clear that they now find out that she can at least really speak. The first words that she says are then tied to words that we hear at the end of the film, which is, will please somebody help me. Then we get to the following sequence where they go see the Derek Jacobi at his antique shop. And there's this very amusing scene where he's hypnotized Miriam Margolyes, who he wants to find out, who used to know, basically, I can't remember which president of the United States it was. Was it Roosevelt?
It's in her previous life, she knew Teddy Roosevelt.
There you go. And, well, it wouldn't even have been her previous life. She's meant to be in her 70s or whatever. So she would have actually known him in her actual life. And at that point, and he wants to know what furniture was in the room so he can figure out where it's ended up. So he's just, using his skills as a hypnotist and to regress people in their memories. So that's just a memory that she's bringing back. So it's repressed memories, or not repressed in this case, but she just forgot that she knew it. But with Thompson, of course, things get very interesting. And this is where Scott Frank, in his writing, is very clever, because Jacobi says to the Emma Thompson character, because she's getting all sort of emotionally tied up, he sort of says, don't tell me exactly what you see. Narrate to me in the third person. So be not the subjective tense, as it were, but the objective. And so she describes what's going on without identifying herself specifically with any of the protagonists of the stories. So we hear what she knows, but not the specifics of the point of view. This, of course, becomes crucial. I think a lot of people tend to miss that in the dialogue, but of course it's very important in terms of the plot. She starts talking about how Margaret met Roman and they became a couple and eventually got married. And some of that is just so beautifully shot. The decision to make it all in black and white. They certainly do this is in the photochemical era. None of this was done digitally. So they had to do a lot of work to make that original color photography look the way it does in black and white, given that it wasn't shot that way. Some of it is just very striking. There's some wonderful ballroom scenes when they're dancing, when they meet, which I think are visually extremely striking and give it that great romantic sweep that we're going for. And so now we enter the past for quite a long section of the story. At this point, we have to start accepting that, unlike the Miriam Margolyes character, who was just remembering something from her extreme youth when she was a young girl, Emma Thompson's character, of course, is too young. She's not remembering her own past. She's remembering somebody else's. This is one of the big significant things about the film, and explains partly why it's Dead Again in the title. It's a story about past lives, which is very unexpected. I think perhaps we accept that more easily now than we might have done in the era in which the film was set. There are a few supernatural noir films, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those later on. Here, I think they handle it very well. I mean, how successful do you think they do what is actually something very difficult here in terms of audience acceptance?
I think they thread the needle incredibly well. I actually wrote down that it's almost exactly half an hour into the film that we then introduce the supernatural bent to this story. And part of what I think actually works so well about the way that this twist is introduced is because Scott Frank, as you have said, is an extremely gifted writer, especially in this film, and he has taken the time to build up the world of the movie that we are able to buy into this supernatural twist. There are so many little details, whether it comes out in the action or in the dialogue, that I think really helps create the down-to-earth atmosphere for the first half hour. Some of my favorite little elements include the woman who's always practicing piano in the apartment directly below Branagh's. It's such a perfect little detail, and it helps fill out the edges of this world a little bit. As you said, Wayne Knight's character describes his own experience with retrograde amnesia, having covered a mass murder as a newspaper reporter, and being so traumatized by what he saw that he completely forgot everything about his own life. Even the scenes of Robin Williams' wonderfully named Cozy Carlisle working in a down at heel grocery store. It all feels so real, so lived in, that we are so accepting then of this sudden change to a plot about past lives, possible reincarnation. Also, it helps that it is Sir Derek Jacobi being the one to do the hypnotizing, and he brings this, the same really fun, gentle quality to his early characterization. And it certainly helps that he has, such a melodious voice. You can't help but, hang on his every word. Going on a tangent, are you susceptible to hypnotism?
I've never even tried it, but I suspect not. I will say right now, I'm one of those people I would probably resist so completely that, I don't even take good advice.
I attended one hypnotist guest speaker in college, and he had us do an exercise in the audience, and I was ashamed of how well I was susceptible to it. I did not get involved. I was not hypnotized, but I feel like I could be, which is upsetting to me. And certainly, if Sir Derek Jacobi is murmuring, instructions about going down a flight of stairs and opening a door, and as I'm staring deeply into a candle, who knows what he could unlock.
And I think it depends which hypnotist you get, frankly, and I think that is very important. Hopefully, as we know from some Sherlock Holmes movies, they can make you look extremely silly, and you end up doing duck impersonations and whatnot. But in this case, or worse, of course. But in this case, it's all actually very benign. And as you say, because the reality of the film is very straightforward, it's not very heightened. Stylistically, a difference between the past and the present, but otherwise, the present is presented in a very understandable fashion. Both the Robin Williams character and the Derek Jacobi character are both completely understanding of the value and possibilities of hypnotism and regression, but also of what Williams' character refers to as the, karmic credit plan, borrow now, pay forever. So it's this idea that in the film, shall we say, the experts have no trouble with this concept, because the skeptic is, of course, Mike Church, the Kenneth Branagh character, where he just sort of looks and sort of says, you expect me to just run with that? But you do, because everybody else does. And of course, we are able to see what she says is going on, because of course we enter the world via the flashback. One of the interesting things about the film, and as you say, one of the nice things about a film that is very cagey from a plotting standpoint, but which is also very smart. And so we do at a certain point start to question, is the narration as reliable as we need it to be? And we know that that's partly to do with how we've been asked to be given the information. It's not necessarily that the person giving it to us isn't being straight with us. They've been asked to deliver it in a certain way, i.e. the objective sense rather than the subjective sense. So they explain certain things without explaining their feelings and where those feelings are coming from. It's all very nicely dovetailed and resolved very neatly as in nice stages as the film progresses. So we've now entered the world of the paranormal, and it's one of really only a handful of noir films, of private eye films, that genuinely engage with that idea. And it's very exciting. I mean, there are a few others. Obviously, there are a few from the 1940s. Some are well known, some are less well known. The best of which is probably something like Alias Nick Beale, which you may not have seen. It's not terribly well known, but it's filmed with Ray Milland and Thomas Mitchell, which is a kind of sell your soul to the devil type film. But it's very much a noir movie made by John Farrow, who also made Night Has a Thousand Eyes, which is an adaptation of a Cornell Woolrich novel. And that one's about, it goes back to a slightly different idea, which is that of a kind of stage psychic who actually seems to be able to foretell the future after all. And then how do you, do you go with the supernatural explanation, or is there something else going on? That sort of idea, but is played by W.G. Robinson in that film, and again is very nicely done. And there are obviously several films that deal with this idea of a psychic who may or may not have genuine abilities, so you have to deal with that idea of whether that's real. From a TV standpoint, of course, my favorite TV show that handles that is Medium. I love Medium. It always winds me up that not enough people adore it the way I do. But one of the things I really like about Medium as a show, this is the show with Patricia Arquette, is that you get all the advantages of dreams which turn out to be literally or partly not literally true, but which help you understand a situation. But they're never ways in which you literally resolve a situation. So by compartmentalizing, shall we say, the supernatural element and the day-to-day element, so that you have a murder mystery and that has to be resolved in the real world, so you don't have spirits coming resolving the problem for you. Which is why I think, on the other hand, a film like What Lies Beneath is which you may or may not have seen, the Robert Zemeckis film with Michelle Pfeiffer and Harrison Ford, is my idea of a bad supernatural thriller, in the sense that, it's actually a very entertaining movie, but it's a Hitchcockian movie where the twist is that there is a supernatural element to it. What's frustrating to
my same criticism of that,
which is that the resolution relies on ghostly or supernatural intervention. My feeling is, I don't mind you having it, but I think they should be separate. And one of the good things about Dead Again is that it does follow that, which I completely agree with.
Absolutely, because Branagh remains the skeptic. He walks out of this hypnotism session still questioning it, and now he's going to investigate a 40-year-old murder, in essence. It doesn't become quite as much of a murder in retrospect kind of story. If anything, the murder mystery element of this plot is really sidetracked in the next 20-30 minutes or so as we follow the romance between Branagh and Thompson. But one of the great strengths, as you say, of this film is the reincarnation and past lives is a crucial part of the plot, but it is still all resolved with a very real world explanation.
Because I think also we have several plots going. They very nicely interconnect. One of the things that I like, when we start getting extended sections of the film in the past, we slightly slide into perhaps slightly more Hitchcockian territory in the way that it seems to be, I think, particularly recalling Rebecca, because we get Hannah Shigula as the housekeeper, who isn't quite Mrs. Danvers, but nonetheless this idea of Emma Thompson's the new lady of the house, and yet somehow her own authority is being undermined by the Hannah Shigula character and her son, who are old, let's call them servants, but anyway, friends of her husband from when he was in Europe, and we later discover that they helped him get out of Nazi Germany and reach the United States, so he feels utterly beholden to them. So while on the one hand it dramatizes a common enough scenario where you're the young wife and yet there's a pre-established setup in the house, so we've seen that in plenty of Gothic literature and movies, and it's an old-fashioned idea. But it does also provide us with necessary additional characters, because we do want to find out what in fact did really happen in the past. How did she get killed? It's sort of sad, she's dead, and also there's this fun little business about the anklet, which makes me think of Double Indemnity, but it's just an anklet. It's an important little clue or a little motif in the film. It has lots of nice little ideas. There's a little bit of there's a fair amount of Rebecca. there's a certain amount of maybe even suspicion. And maybe, I don't know what you think about this, perhaps even a little bit of Vertigo, in the sense that Vertigo is a film that leans in a little bit into this idea of past lives. Although in Vertigo, that's definitely a ruse. And here we know it definitely isn't.
Vertigo definitely goes in a very different direction with the reincarnation and the past lives. I was definitely thinking of Vertigo while watching this movie, particularly in the final act, and I certainly think it is deliberate, especially when we see the apartment building in which Emma Thompson is living. Her artist studio, I should say, not to jump all the way to the end of the film, but it's definitely evocative of the tower in Vertigo, and I think it is definitely a deliberate homage, especially when you consider the themes of past lives, reincarnation, despite how Vertigo goes in a very different direction.
One of the interesting little nuggets about the film is you get that scene towards the end where Hannah Shigula is watching television. The film she is watching is Sorry, Wrong Number, which is a terrific film noir from 1948, starring Barbara Stanwyck and Burt Lancaster, and written by Lucille Fletcher, who had at the time that she'd originally written the radio play version of that, was in fact the wife of Bernard Herrmann. They were pretty much divorced by the time the film version came out. I think that's about right. Anyway, originally, and incidentally, there is a reference to that in the Jack Ryan film that Branagh made. There's a sequence where he runs past a cinema and the marquee is showing Sorry, Wrong Number. And in fact, you go inside and you see the opening. The reason for that is that these are all films made by Paramount, so they own the rights. So that's the rationale. In the film, and this is where I think it's really good to have a quick talk about it, and I'm going to ask your opinion about it. Originally, Branagh wanted to use a clip from Dial M for Murder, which of course has the scene with the scissors as the murder instrument.
Yes.
But that's made by Warner Brothers, and they couldn't get the rights.
Oh, that is interesting. I'm glad that we brought it up because I always feel that there is something to be learned when characters in a movie are watching another movie, whether it's on TV or they're at a movie. And I have not seen Sorry, Wrong Number in a long time. I remember loving it, but I don't remember much about it at the moment. So I was wondering what connections there might be thematically to that. But knowing that he wanted Dial M for Murder, which is a movie that is clearly something that Branagh has come back to again and again from a stylistic perspective, that makes a lot more sense, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's a bigger fan of Hitchcock than he is of Anatoly Litvak. But also, but of course, the other tiny little connection, maybe, is that there's that scene, rather charming scene, when they go out on the date and he reads her tea bag, right, rather than the tea leaves. And he sort of says, your name is Grace. And of course, Grace Kelly was the star of Dial M for Murder.
Sure.
So I don't know if that was on his mind or just Grace is a nice name and again has a sort of religious connotation. After all, he's called Mike Church. So, you know, they're playing for that a little bit. But so I don't know. One can, of course, read too much into that. But clearly, this is a film with lots of Hitchcock links and touches. And therefore, Dial M for Murder would have made a lot of sense. But yeah, unfortunately, it either would have been that or Spellbound. Spellbound would have been the other one where you get a sequence with big scissors cutting the eye, sort of. The Dali.
Absolutely.
And of course, there's a reference to that when we go to her studio. Very briefly, when we go to Emma Thompson, when Emma Thompson gets her ID back and she finds out who she really is in a present sense. And they go to her apartment where she is a painter, not just a painter, but in fact an artist. She's also a sculptress.
She's done her own persistence of memory with the scissors instead of clocks.
That's right.
They're, melting all over.
Well, that's what I was going to say, because of course the melting scissors are, of course, a Dali pastiche, and of course Dali designed the scissors shot from Spellbound. By the way, have you seen Dario Argento's Tenebre?
It is on my to-watch list.
When you've watched it,
I
we'll talk
know it
about
is
it
a movie
again.
I will love.
I
I
tell you
already
what,
know it.
that might be good for a podcast, but I'll say no more because there is a link. But you need to watch the film first, so I'll say nothing else. One of the very interesting things you said to me when we were sort of talking about discussing this film was, how would Brian De Palma do this? Which I thought was very intriguing. Now, I'm a huge De Palma fan, so it doesn't take much to get me thinking about De Palma into almost any kind of movie. In particular, I think I said to you that the film that particularly comes to mind is Obsession, which is a film that sort of combines Rebecca and Vertigo to create a sort of new narrative in a particularly bizarre and very, very strange manner that you could only do in the mid-70s, and even then they had a bit of trouble, frankly. Let's not get into too much of the detail of that, but it's very, very weird. Fascinating, but very weird, and no surprise that Paul Schrader co-wrote it, I think. I mean, yes, from the man who gave us Taxi Driver. Actually, now it makes sense. But in that film, you sort of look at how he would do a story about someone who is haunted by the past and someone who is obsessed in his own way with someone from the past. Fundamentally, the negative impact that can have, particularly when you realize they're being manipulated by a third party that's setting one up against the other. I think it's a very good call of yours, Nick. But certainly if De Palma in 1991 was shooting this and hadn't been making Raising Cain, which is a brilliant movie.
Great movie.
Great movie and very funny. One knows it would have been, stylistically, it might have had certain similarities. It would have been a different kind of romance and probably would have been darker. Do you think?
Oh, absolutely. It would have been romance would definitely have been more physical. I think I love De Palma, but it definitely would have felt a little bit more lascivious than romantic as it does in the Branagh film. Would De Palma have been content to simply have black and white represent the past, or would he have found some other, stylistic approach to separate the two timelines?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah.
As much as I love Dead Again, and I wonder what it would be like to live in a parallel universe where we had De Palma's Dead Again, maybe starring Bruce Willis and John Lithgow in the Jacoby role. It's a very different film. It's a very interesting film, but it would not have the same, I think, playful overtones as the Branagh version does.
He certainly would have probably done even more, one suspects, with the point of view playfulness, which I feel like we shouldn't discuss because I think it's such a clever and unexpected plot twist that it's kind of a shame to ruin it for those who haven't seen it. But point of view is so important in film noir, particularly when there are a number of film noirs, as you say, that rely on flashback and multiple flashbacks. So say something like Laura, for instance, but of course, I don't know if you know it, there's another film by John Brahm called The Locket. Robert Mitchum's in it. It's a terrific movie and it's very, very psychoanalytical. But it's that film, along with Michael Curtiz's Passage to Marseille, that has a flashback within a flashback within a flashback. So it's determined to make your life difficult. And you watch it and you're thinking, is this just you guys being a bit undisciplined? Could you really not think of another way around this without having characters within a flashback, which is already within a flashback, having to tell you something else that you're going to visualize in flashback? But in that film, it's very easy to pinpoint the two movies that do that. Whereas otherwise, you get into ways of telling stories like, say, Rashomon, where you have competing flashbacks. The film of De Palma's that does that the best, I mean, he did the Rashomon approach in Snake Eyes, but the one that goes into dream and flashback within flashback, or maybe something else, is Femme Fatale, obviously a perfect noir title, and there is going to be a whole episode about Femme Fatale on this podcast eventually, but his 2002 film in many ways is kind of, for me, his kind of last great movie and a real kind of masterpiece of that only he could have made. It's kind of such a super typical De Palma movie.
It
You
is.
wonder, therefore, on that basis, how he might have wanted to, shall we say, wallow. And yet, actually, one of the interesting things about this film is it has a terrific soundtrack by Patrick Doyle, who has done practically all of Branagh's films. They're old friends, and who, after this, very shortly after this, would collaborate with De Palma on Carlito's Way, for instance. So it's not that De Palma couldn't work within some of the same territory and couldn't do something that was not indulged, because I think De Palma is a filmmaker who tends to separate those films that he writes himself and those that he does as collaborations with other writers, and so can be very disciplined in that way. The expectations are different, and he's savvy enough to understand that. And it's like Branagh himself, he ended up with an Oscar for Best Screenplay for Belfast, for instance.
Sure.
And yet here I think he's wants to serve the story, and he loves the golden age aspect of it and all these things, and does it really, really well. But I love how the various triangles in the story, you have the two couples played by the same actors, and then you have Hannah Shigula as the housekeeper, Andy Garcia as the journalist, and then eventually the Derek Jacobi character as these kind of vertices of other triangles in terms of the dynamics of the characters that take them in different places. And diagrammatically, that's sort of fascinating just to look at it that way. You realize there's a lot of heavy thinking that's gone into making sure it all works. I think that it does deliver. I mean, more importantly than anything else, it doesn't get lost in trying to do the paranormal, do the past, do the homage, have the Kenneth Branagh and Emma story. They were married at the time and they made several films together at the time. And so it's not just an indulgent love fest where he's getting his costume designer, his production designer, his composer and his wife and his best mate, Derek Jacobi, to do their own version of a Hollywood movie. It's the real thing. And it's very satisfying, I think, from that point of view. I mean, is there anything in it that, having rewatched it, that you think doesn't hold up? I mean, obviously, I can talk about it holding up because I saw it when it was new. But in terms of when you first saw it, do you find, now that you're a little bit older, do you approach it differently? I mean, I still think it's great.
No, I do too. I'm sort of predisposed to it because I like Branagh as much as I do. And I find his, frankly, maximalist approach to just about everything that he takes on to be something that I can really connect with and really engage with. And I suppose if you're not on board for what Branagh is going to deliver, then your mileage will, with this film, or really any in his filmography, will vary. So I suppose someone from 2024 watching this movie will say, oh, it's melodramatic. Oh, it's over the top. His accent work is bad. I frankly don't think it's terrible.
But he had to do a German accent. He had to do an American accent. He had to direct the movie. Hey.
Interestingly, just before our recording, I found the Siskel and Ebert clip where they discuss this film. Siskel is really down on it. He says that it feels artificial and that it's manipulative and that it's trying so hard to garner a reaction from its audience.
I thought the entire film was overwrought from start to finish. In fact, as technically well shot as it is, both in color and in black and white, I started getting angry at this film, rejecting its manipulation of me because I thought both of Branagh's characters were heartless technical exercises.
I'm in complete disagreement. This movie goes on my list of the best films of the year. You say it's too ambitious, but what he's doing here is he's letting out all the stops. He's going all the way.
To a certain extent, he's right, but I can't help but side with Roger Ebert, who says that the movie is fun. It's made for fun. It is a deliberate throwback to Golden Age Hollywood. It's supposed to be melodramatic and over the top. And I think the bigger conversation would be what if those black and white segments weren't in black and white? If it had originally all been in color, would the reputation of this movie be different? I feel like you're able to get away with more when you're deliberately evoking a different style, a different era of filmmaking, when you are very deliberately making a throwback. Because Branagh is such a connoisseur of film and such a connoisseur of an older generation and an older style. I mean, he's clearly emulating Hitchcock and Orson Welles in most things that he does. You can look at scenes, out of context, even in Hamlet, and find a parallel to Touch of Evil. Two stories that are worlds apart from each other, but stylistically, he has found a link between Shakespeare and Wells. Not to say that Wells, didn't do Shakespeare, because he clearly did. Yeah. Wells working in a very different genre. For me, that's why it continues to hold up, because it doesn't have any pretensions of being anything other than what it is.
Absolutely. And in fact, one of the nice things about rewatching it ahead of this podcast was realizing that it had several connections to Branagh's most recent film, A Haunting in Venice. I hadn't really thought of when I saw that. I mean, I think, well, it's a Poirot movie, but in fact, he seems to be wearing the same mask at a certain point. He's got the same sort of black mask. I thought, oh my goodness, it probably isn't exactly the same, but it looks the same. But in the same way that it has that confrontation between the purely rational and the seeming supernatural, and whether you accept that or not becomes the crux of the narrative, whether that helps you get on with your life and move on or not. It's something that they clearly have in common in a really interesting way. And that was a revelation, actually. I genuinely hadn't thought about that.
No, I hadn't really thought about that either, because, A Haunting in Venice is so steeped in Agatha Christie and Golden Age mystery. It very much is its own entity. Again, I think because Branagh is sort of a magpie when it comes to his creative work, because he's picking bits and pieces from all of his influences, you see the same DNA of him copying De Palma stylistically in Dead Again that you do in both his Murder on the Orient Express adaptation and A Haunting in Venice, as well as bits that he's taking from, it's specifically about A Haunting in Venice, Don't Look Now or Eyes Wide Shut. Little, bits of inspiration everywhere that you wouldn't necessarily think make sense for that given text or that given work, and yet I feel like he, sticks the landing each time.
I mean, it's a very varied filmography. I mean, this was a very popular film in its day. It did well for what was modestly budgeted film in America. I think it cost about $15 million. I think in America it made close to 40, and then there's the rest of the world, and then home video and television. This is a film that made more than a tidy profit for Paramount. And he's then gone on to did an opera. He did a version of The Magic Flute. He lots more Shakespeare, including his version of Much Ado About Nothing, which is certainly one of the more commercially successful adaptations of Shakespeare, and I think a terrific movie, actually. I love that film.
It is probably my favorite thing of his. It's so joyful and so just beautiful. I love his.
It's wonderfully done and shot up the road from where I used to live in Umbria, so that's okay. So that makes me like it.
Oh, wow.
Well, it's strictly speaking Tuscany. We don't like to talk about Tuscany because Umbria is way better, but nonetheless, they are basically adjacent. And then, of course, there's the big box office bonanza type films that he's made, such as not only the Poirot films, which have been very popular, but also the Thor film as part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and his Cinderella film for Disney, which was, again, a massive hit. And again, with Derek Jacobi, and is actually a very good movie. I think this cycle of Disney films that they have financed that remake their classic animations have not always been very successful. I don't think Tim Burton's Dumbo is particularly good, for instance. And I don't think Robert Zemeckis' Pinocchio is particularly good either. But Branagh's Cinderella, excellent. There are some of those films that have worked really well and that did very well commercially, that there was wide audience acceptance. So some of what he does, I think, And obviously Belfast, as a smaller, more personal film, nonetheless did well and won awards and so on. So there's an interesting dynamic there. I mean, I'd love to see him do a Bond movie or something like that. On the other hand, when he did his Jack Ryan film, I mean, it's a perfectly decent movie, but it wasn't actually very successful at the box office. There wasn't much of a taste for doing the early years of Jack Ryan. I'm actually slightly surprised. I thought it was a decent movie, but there you go. So, you know, maybe there won't be much desire for him to do spy films. I don't know.
I rewatched Christopher Nolan's Tenet last week.
And?
You see him get his Bond villain out of his system in that movie. And I mean, he's great. He's great in it. Actually spoke backwards for that film instead of
really
simply, you know, running the dialogue back. I'm very excited that his next project, which is, I believe, currently filming right now, is a psychological thriller entitled The Last Disturbance of Madeline Hind, starring Jodie Comer, Patricia Arquette, Michael Sheen. We know nothing about it other than that it's a psychological thriller being filmed right now.
And he's written it himself.
He is writing and directing it. So it's sort of fun to see that he's coming full circle, in essence, coming back to something like Dead Again after
If
all
only
this
they
time.
could get Patricia Arquette to play a medium. I think on that note, Nick, I get to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast to talk about this terrific little movie. I hope you'll come back so that we can talk about lots of other noir titles in the future.
I hope so. If there's one thing I have learned, it's that I deserve a little bit of a film noir education, so I can use this podcast as an excuse to fill in the gaps of my knowledge.
Oh, great. Well, listen, thanks so much again. Can't wait to have you back. Take care, mate.
Thank you so much.
You have been listening to Tipping My Fedora, the show about all things noir. It is produced for Castiglione Publishing by me, Sergio Angelini, and our theme tune is by Petar Milinkovic, whose work is available through Tailkeeper Music. All audio clips are the copyright of their respective owners, and used under fair dealing and fair use exceptions solely for the purposes of criticism and review. Please subscribe to Tipping My Fedora wherever you get your podcast fix. And it would be great if you could leave ratings and reviews about the show at Apple Podcasts. Be seeing you.